After so many years working with elderly patients, I started noticing something that, at first, made me uncomfortable, but I couldn't quite explain why. It wasn't the suffering. It wasn't the pain. And it wasn't death either. It was something else. Harder to define. Because it doesn't show up clearly. It doesn't have a name in any medical chart. And still, it was always there. Almost like a silent pattern repeating itself from one patient to another. My name is Anna. I've been a nurse for 13 years. And most of that time has been spent caring for elderly people at different stages of life. Some arrived alert, independent, still holding a certain firmness in their eyes. Others came in already fragile. Not just physically, but in a way no test could measure. And over time, by observing these small details, something started to make sense. I began to notice that two patients with the same age, the same diagnosis, sometimes even the same medical history, would react in completely different ways. One seemed diminished, as if they had already given up before even trying, while the other, despite limitations, still asserted themselves, still chose, still reacted. And that didn't come from the body. It didn't come from the illness. Came from somewhere else. A place I slowly began to understand. I remember one very specific moment. An older man, relatively stable, nothing critical. But every time someone asked him something simple, "Do you want water? Do you want to sit? Are you comfortable?" he would look at his daughter first. In silence. As if the answer no longer belonged to him. And his daughter would always answer for him. Quickly. Automatically. Almost without noticing. At the time it caught my attention. But it didn't seem serious. Looked like care. Looked like love. Looked like protection. But then I started seeing it again. With other patients. Other families. Other stories. Always the same pattern. Small decisions being made for them. Simple things. Everyday things. Until, over time, the person stopped answering altogether. Not because they couldn't, but because they no longer did. And that's when I began to understand that something was being taken away. Long before any hospitalization. Long before the illness progressed. Long before the body failed. Something invisible. Something that didn't cause immediate pain. But once it was completely gone, left behind a kind of emptiness that's hard to describe. Because it wasn't just about needing help. It was about no longer participating, no longer deciding, no longer existing actively within their own life. And the hardest part to realize is that this almost always happens with good intentions. Families trying to help, to make things easier, to prevent effort, to avoid mistakes, to reduce risk. But without realizing, they were slowly occupying spaces that once belonged to that person. And those spaces never came back. They never do. And by the time the patient reached me, it wasn't just the body that had weakened. It was something deeper. Something that used to hold together who that person was. Even in old age. And the most silent part of all is that almost no one recognizes this process while it's still happening. Because it doesn't feel alarming. It doesn't interrupt daily life. It doesn't seem urgent. But it is constant. And when it's done, there's nothing left to recover. That's when, over the years, I stopped looking only at symptoms and started paying attention to something that doesn't show up in any test. But once it's gone, it completely changes how someone ages. I remember exactly the day he arrived. It wasn't a dramatic entrance. No one rushed. There was no urgency. Just another elderly patient being transferred. One of those cases that, on paper, seem simple. His name was Mr. Alberto. He was 78. Stable condition, controlled diagnosis. Nothing that, at first glance, explained the way he walked into that room. Because what caught my attention wasn't his physical state. It was the silence. A different kind of silence. Not the silence of pain or exhaustion. It was a silence of absence. He didn't complain, didn't ask questions, didn't react. His daughter was always by his side. Very attentive, very present. The kind of person who fixes everything before anyone even asks. Before I finished a question, she already had the answer. Before he moved, she adjusted the pillow. Before he tried to speak, she explained for him. And at first, like always, it looked like care. It looked like dedication. It looked like love. And maybe it was. But something didn't sit right. I remember asking him directly one of the first days, "Mr. Alberto, would you like to sit up for a bit?" He looked at me, then looked at his daughter, and waited. He just stayed there, as if the answer depended on someone else. His daughter replied, "He doesn't want to, he gets tired." But he hadn't said anything, and that stayed with me, because it wasn't an isolated moment. The next day, the same thing. During his bath, mealtime, even when it came to simple choices, like opening the window, he always looked at her first. Always. As if he had unlearned something basic. As if deciding was no longer part of who he was. And little by little, I started observing more closely. He could still do small things. He could hold a cup, adjust his position, answer when someone actually gave him the time. But almost no one did. Because someone was always stepping in first. Always making things easier. Always anticipating. And what looked like help was slowly erasing him. Quietly. Without conflict. Without resistance. Without visible pain. It was as if, with every small decision taken away, something inside him was being turned off. And the most striking part was that no one noticed. His daughter felt useful, present, needed, and he was slowly fading. Not from the room, but from himself. I began to notice he spoke less each day. Not because he couldn't, but because no one expected him to. His gaze started to change. More distant, less focused, as if he was there, but not entirely. And there was one moment that stayed with me. I entered the room earlier than usual that day. His daughter hadn't arrived yet. It was the first time he was alone since being admitted. And I asked the same question as always. "Mr. Alberto, would you like to sit up for a bit?" This time, he didn't look at anyone. He stayed quiet for a few seconds. And then he answered, softly, almost as if the words were rusty. "I would." It was simple. But it was different from everything I had seen until then. I helped him sit up. Slowly. No rush. And for a few minutes, he seemed more present. More whole. But it didn't last. Because when his daughter arrived, everything went back to the same pattern. Quick answers. Anticipated decisions. His silence. Her presence. And that's when I began to understand. The problem wasn't his medical condition. It was what had been happening long before. Long before that room. Long before the hospitalization. Something that had been built, little by little. Day after day. Home. In small decisions. In small, "let me do it for you." In "it's better this way." In "he can't anymore." And by the time he reached me, it was already solid. He was still alive. But he was no longer leading his own life. And that didn't happen all at once. Happened slowly. So subtly that it looked like care. In the days that followed, nothing changed suddenly. And maybe that was exactly what caught my attention the most. Because when something gets worse slowly, it almost never feels like it's getting worse. Just feels normal. The routine continued. His daughter arrived early, organized everything, spoke for him, decided for him, and he remained there, present, but less and less involved. I started noticing small details, things that, if you're not paying attention, you completely miss. During meals, for example, He could still hold utensils. But he was rarely given the chance to try. Because she would already bring everything ready. Separated. And sometimes even feed him. Even when he didn't ask. First he still reacted. A small movement of the hand. A slight adjustment in posture. As if he wanted to participate. But those movements started fading. Not overnight. But gradually. Like everything in that process. One day, I intentionally left the tray a little farther away. Not by accident. But because I wanted to see what he would do. He looked at it. Took a few seconds. And with some effort, pulled it closer. It was a simple gesture. Almost insignificant. But it was a choice. It was his action. But before that could happen again, his daughter walked in. And automatically rearranged everything. Moved it closer. Adjusted it. Corrected it. Without realizing. Undoing that small independent action he had just made. And that started happening more and more often. Not just with him. But with other patients too. Small initiatives being interrupted. Small attempts being replaced. Small efforts being avoided. Always with the same silent justification. It's easier this way. It's faster. It's better for him. And maybe it was in the short term. But over time, I started noticing the cumulative effect. The body still responded. But the will didn't. The ability still existed. But the impulse disappeared. And that doesn't show up in tests. Doesn't appear in diagnoses. But it's visible. In behavior. In posture. In the eyes. Mr. Alberto started sleeping more. Not because he needed to. But because there was no stimulation. Conversations faded. Not because he didn't understand. But because no one expected an answer anymore. And the most striking moment was when he began to anticipate the silence. Before someone answered for him. He simply stopped trying. Stopped looking. Stopped reacting. It was as if he had learned. He no longer needed to participate. That someone else would do it. That someone else would decide. And at that point, it was no longer about help. It was about replacement. And there's a very subtle difference between those two things. Help preserves. Replacement erases. But that line is so thin. Almost no one notices when they cross it. And the hardest part to accept is that no one there was doing anything wrong. There was no neglect, no abandonment, quite the opposite. There was presence, love, and still, something essential was being lost. Quietly, without conflict, without resistance. Mr. Alberto didn't complain, didn't ask for space. Didn't say anything. He just adapted. And maybe that's the most dangerous part of all. Because when a person stops resisting, it doesn't mean everything is okay. Sometimes, it means they've understood there's no point in trying anymore. And that's when I realized. This process wasn't physical. It was behavioral, emotional, existential. And it was already far more advanced than any exam could show. And the quietest part of all is that from the outside, it just looked like a family taking good care of someone they loved. But on the inside, something was slowly coming to an end. Without announcement, without rupture, without return. And it was on one of those seemingly ordinary days that something became impossible to ignore. Nothing serious happened. No clinical worsening. No complications. And yet, something had shifted. I walked into the room in the middle of the afternoon. The lights were dim. The TV was on, but no one was really watching. Mr. Alberto was lying down. Open. But unfocused. His daughter sat beside him, scrolling on her phone. Present, but not truly connected. And for a few seconds, I just stood there, without saying anything. Because after a while in this profession, you learn that what reveals the most isn't what people say. It's what happens when no one is trying to explain anything. And in that silence, you could feel it. Something was already gone. Not his body, not his awareness, but something deeper. I stepped closer and asked a simple question. The same one as always. Mr. Alberto, are you comfortable? This time, he didn't look at his daughter. Didn't look at me. He took longer than usual, as if searching for the answer inside himself, but not finding it. And then, before he could say anything, his daughter answered. He is, and kept looking at her phone. And that was the exact moment. Something finally made sense to me in a way it never had before. Because it was no longer just about someone answering for him. It was about him no longer trying to answer. And there's a quiet but definitive difference between those two things. Before he still searched, still looked, still waited. Now he didn't. It was as if the part of him that participated had been turned off. Not because he lacked the ability, but because he lacked the space. Because no one realizes how much a person needs space until they start living without it. And in that moment, I understood something that completely changed the way I see aging. The problem was never his illness, never his age, never his physical limitation. The problem was the silent process that happened before. Little by little, without intention, without harm, but also without awareness. He didn't lose his autonomy in that room. He arrived there, already without it. And the hospital only made it visible, more obvious, impossible to ignore. And the hardest part to accept is that this wasn't an isolated case. I'd seen this before, many times, different names, different families, different stories, but always the same invisible ending. People who still could, but no longer did. People who still knew, but no longer decided. People who were still there, but no longer led anything in their own lives. And almost always surrounded by care, by presence, by good intentions, but without the one thing that, in the end, held everything together. And that's when I understood very clearly. Something that never shows up in any test but defines everything that comes after. People don't lose autonomy all at once. They give it away. A little each day. Sometimes out of exhaustion. Sometimes for convenience. Sometimes because someone steps in. And they allow it. 'Cause it feels easier. Feels safer. Feels better. Until one day, they don't know how to take it back. And when they realize, they're no longer participating in their own life. And the quietest part of all is that no one around them calls it loss. They call it care. And after all of this, there's a part no one really wants to hear. Not families, not even the patients themselves. Because it's uncomfortable. It's hard to accept. And most of the time, it comes too late. I'm not saying this as someone who read it in a book, or someone who studied theory. I'm saying this as someone who has seen this ending many times. Quietly. Without drama. Without warning. People don't grow old and suddenly lose everything. They start losing things long before. Much earlier than anyone realizes. And almost always, the first thing they lose is something no one values while they still have it. The ability to decide. Choose. To say no. To do things their own way. Even if it's not the most efficient way. Because over time, efficiency starts replacing autonomy. Speed starts replacing participation. Care starts replacing true presence. And when that happens, something essential begins to disappear. Not all at once, but through small daily concessions. Let me do it. It's easier this way. You might get it wrong. Better not risk it. And little by little, the person accepts it. Not because they want to, but because it makes sense. Feels comfortable. Feels safe. Until one day, they no longer know how to take that space back. And that's when something changes permanently. Because the body might still function. The mind might still work. But identity starts to fade. And there's no treatment for that. No therapy. No intervention that can fully restore it. Because it wasn't lost all at once. It was something that simply stopped being exercised. And anything we stop exercising, the body might recover. But meaning, not always. I've seen extremely dedicated children. Always present. But who, without realizing, stopped asking, "What do you want?" I've seen elderly people who still had opinions, but no longer had space. People who still had desires, but no longer had permission. And over time, those three things disappear together. Opinion, desire, permission. And when that happens, what remains is just physical presence. A life that is still being lived, but no longer led. And that's the hardest part to accept. It's not age that takes this away. It's not the hospital. It's not the illness. Many times, it's us. Without realizing. With good intentions. But with consequences no one teaches us to recognize. And I'm not saying this to blame anyone. 'Cause I know that, most of the time, it starts with love. With care. With the fear of seeing someone we love suffer. But there's a big difference between protecting someone and slowly replacing them in their own life. And that line is invisible until it's already been crossed. Today, when I walk into a room, I don't just see a patient. I see everything that came before. The choices that were made. The spaces that were taken. The silences that were accepted. Because in the end, what leaves the deepest mark isn't the moment someone needs help. It's the moment they stop being invited to participate. And that happens much earlier than we think. Long before old age. Long before illness. And almost always, it begins in such an ordinary way that no one notices. I'm not saying this just as a nurse. I'm saying this as someone who has stood beside many beds at the end. And who, looking back, can almost always see exactly where everything started to change.